Before we move into our panel, or I should say, as we move into our panel, I'm hoping that you all will join me in the establishment of ground rules. I think it's really important that we have ground rules because this isn't going to be a traditional panel where we have 3 talking heads and they just talk at you and then we have 3 minutes at the end for questions. We really want this to be a dialogue, and I know that I've seen a lot of dialoguing, and I am excited to hear what comes out of this group. But as we go into this, the next 2 sessions are going to be engaging folks who are experts in the field, working on these issues every day, but we definitely want to encourage you all to actively participate. So the ground rules, if I had them written out on the board, which I don't, so you're actually going to have to listen and possibly write them down if you think you might forget. But my role is to really make sure that I enforce this set of ground rules. So I hope you will all be patient with me as I try to be impatient with you all with shenanigans. But I think that this is really the work. This is why we're here. We're not just here to be in a different environment, to have some moonshine later on tonight, although that's among the reasons that we're here. We're also here to really strengthen this supermajority that we've been building for a really long time. So I want to start with the letter E. So the ground rules spell out equity. But before I start with that, I want to say that the poet Mark Nepo said, "To listen is to lean in softly with a willingness to be changed by what you hear." So we're going to start with the letter E. E, everyone should participate fully. So we're here to have one conversation. And that's not just important so that we can all actually hear, being mindful that we have different limitations with our ability to do so, but also recognizing that we are documenting this conversation for future generations to understand the business of this summit. So you might not have been invited to sit at the table and be a panelist, but you are a co-creator of what we're going to accomplish today. So it's very, very important that you're participating in this one conversation, right? So what that means is, as I'm going through this rule, I want everyone to take out your cell phone and turn it off. And I don't mean put it on vibrate. I don't mean put it on silent. I mean turn it off. And that's because it's really important that this is a sacred space for dialogue. You're gonna get the alert, you're gonna look down, and in that moment, you might have misunderstood or misheard something that someone else said, and then you're gonna walk away saying, that person's rude or nasty, they don't respect, you know? So we really, 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 if you do have your phone in this space, I wanna invite you and encourage you to take it out of your pocket and turn it off. Whatever emergency might come up, you can handle it after the break, because before, the 2000s, we didn't have those in these meeting spaces, so it can be done. And that also goes with the no side conversations. So if you need someone to repeat something they said, instead of leading to your neighbor and asking them, you can raise the hand and share your question with the group. Maybe someone else has that same question. So I know that, you know, we're a culture of communication, and so the folks that are closest to you, you might want to share your thought or your reflection, but I promise you we have lots of time for you to have that side conversation once this one conversation is completed. So let's really, really, really use our notepads to write down anything you think you might forget and just not have any side conversations. And then along with that, hold the mic, pass the mic. So if you're a person who generally is more quiet and reflective, I want you to challenge yourself to share your voice in this space. Share what you are thinking or reflecting upon as we're engaging in this dialogue together. So E, everyone should participate fully. The letter Q is question your assumptions. And that means listen to understand, not to respond. I think there's a tendency to start preparing your rebuttal. You hear one thing that the person says, and then you don't listen to anything else they say because you're planning out what you're going to say to respond to them, or you think you have a better way of saying it. I really want to encourage everyone to challenge your assumptions. The information you have that has formed your opinion could be incomplete. So I'm not going to say that your assumption is wrong, but you may hear something in this space that guides you to a new truth, a new understanding, but that can only be accomplished by listening to those that are speaking and listening fully for them to finish their statement and not for you to start writing your thesis in your mind of how you're going to respond, okay? So Q, question your assumptions. U, use our group time to solve problems. So we have a very limited amount of time, and we could spend all of this time literally venting. We could spend all of this time talking about 2501, right? We could spend all this entire hour talking about all the ways in which racial equity has not yet been achieved. Or we can use this time to be a part of the solutions for what that looks like moving forward. So part of how we can do that is to use this strategy. So we're already actively listening. Don't just shoot your arm up as soon as someone's finished talking, right? Like, we're going to pause, reflect, plan, and then share. And that does a couple of things. It allows you to integrate what you've heard, but it also gives you a chance to not ramble. Because if you're just in the middle of talking, you raise your hand so quickly you want to share, and then you're just like 30 minutes later, everyone else is asleep, okay? So we're going to make sure that we use this limited time that we have together to problem solve. I statements only, right? So you're speaking from your place of truth. You're not generalizing that to groups. You're not generalizing about anyone outside of your internal experience. So what does that look like? I heard you say blank. Is that what you said? Or I have had this experience, instead of all Black farmers, we as Black farmers, because there could be another Black farmer in the room that does not agree with your opinion. So we're going to use I statements only. T, truth with compassion, with a focus on the compassion part. So your truth, you might immediately hear something that conflicts or is contradictory to your truth. I want you to use love to help that person expand their understanding, their experience of coming from your perspective. So you can share your truth without making statements that are derogatory, inflammatory, I'm not asking you all to censor yourselves, but I am inviting us to use this space as one of compassion, where no one should leave this space. And this one is very important to me because we have a limited time together. And I've been in rooms like this where folks leave and they say, well, the Black farmers hate Latin farmers because one Black farmer said this thing. And I've had folks come up to me and tell me that, you know, and so we don't want anyone to walk away feeling that their experience, their humanity, their personhood is less than. So it's really important that as you share your truth, you think about the other person's experience of that truth by using compassion. Disrespect is a deal breaker. So we collectively as a group, we're not going to tolerate it. And that's not just going to be me. We're all going to agree to not tolerate any disrespect. So no one should walk away from this convening, or if they're watching this video, to say, wow, someone said something really offensive to my group and no one in that room checked them. Because we're all going to be participating in that disrespect being tolerated if we don't all stick to truth with compassion. And finally, yes and instead of yes but. And what does that mean? I want to encourage you to build on ideas. And I'm going to give you a tool to help with that when you raise your hand. So, you know, sometimes you are so excited to share your genius with the group, but it is the complete opposite direction that the conversation's going in. So we're going in a direction of everyone starting to have the same conversation, the same understanding, and you want to go left, right? Or stage left, whichever that is. I I want you to use the system of thinking about how can you build on an idea that's been shared instead of knocking it down, contradicting it, derailing it in some way. So one tool that we're going to use to accomplish that is if you want to say something that is going to change the direction of the conversation, I want you to put one finger up when you raise your hand. So one means I'm going in a different direction, right? Like, I hear what you're saying. I'm gonna let you finish, but we're going over here. So I wanna see the number one if you wanna change the course of the conversation. If you wanna add on to or build onto an idea that's being shared, I want you to put two fingers, because that's your solidarity hand raise. So if you're in solidarity, if you're going in the same direction that the conversation's going in, you're gonna put two fingers up. If you're going in a completely different direction of the conversation, you're gonna put one finger up, okay? But we're gonna have a mindset of yes and instead of yes but. So we're trying to, well, there's no three. You won't get called on if you have a three. So ground rules clear. And I need to hear an affirmation of this. Are we all agreed upon these ground rules? Yes. Any opposed? Okay, so thank you so much, Nikki. See, I told y'all, she's back there. Okay, we have notebooks in the center and pens as well. So as I'm introducing the panelists, if you would like to grab one of those, as I stated, to jot down your ideas, immediately following this panel discussion, we're gonna give you all a block of time to reflect, write, share with your neighbor, share with the folks you came with, what reflections came up for you. So if you already have notes, a notepad, that's fine, but we wanna make sure that everyone knows they're available. Okay. So now we're going to move into our first conversation, and it's called Excluded Communities, Separate Histories, Shared Struggles, and Solidarity. Our first speaker, and each of the speakers is gonna share a little bit. They're gonna introduce themselves. They're gonna share a little bit about their work, because we wanna give you all something to reflect and respond to. We didn't wanna just out the gate ask you, so what do you think about exclusion from participation in Farm Bill programs? So we're gonna give you some thought leaders' reflections on the work that they're doing to help inspire your responses. So our first speaker will be Fain of the Intertribal Agriculture Council. She will be followed by Treakle of the National Family Farm Coalition. Unfortunately, Edna Rodriguez from RAFI International is unable to be here due to illness, but we also will be having on our panel today Sommer Sibilly-Brown from Virgin Islands Good Food Coalition. So each of our speakers are going to share the work that they do, their reflections on excluded communities, and they'll each speak for about 10 minutes, and then we're going to invite you all to participate in the conversation.
Good morning. Thank you so much for letting me be here with you all today. I'm thrilled to be part of this panel. As Dãnia said, I'm Fain with the Intertribal Ag Council. I'm an enrolled citizen of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, and I'm based out of Tulsa, Oklahoma. I have really enjoyed each session we've had thus far. I particularly enjoyed hearing Dr. Christopher start the day's discussion with the fallacy of white supremacy, especially in the realm of agriculture. I know the notion that Indians are savage or somehow uneducated predates the United States and was prevalent throughout this country's history, but it's only in recent years that Western science in the space of ag is catching up to regenerative ag practices that are founded in traditional ecological knowledge from the people who knew how to make the use of the land that they came from. And so it's so good to hear the perspectives and how, you know, while our history is different, even the history of my tribe is different than the 38 other tribes in the state of Oklahoma and the 573 other federally recognized tribes in the country, but we all have similarities that really serve to strengthen our voice and some of the influence that we can have. So the Intertribal Ag Council was formed in 1987 in response to a report by the National Indian Agriculture Working Group, which Congress had tasked with assessing the status of agriculture in Indian country or on Indian lands, which are trust lands, that the land that is held in trust by the United States for the benefit of Indian tribes or individual Indians. And in that, they released a report in 1987 that outlined their major findings. It revealed that agriculture was the most promising revenue-generating industry on Indian lands. And this was at the same time as the advent of tribal gaming as well, but it was agriculture that was the most promising endeavor. But the findings also reflected the dismal state of federal programs responsible for serving reservations. Outdated, mismanaged programs were missing key economic opportunities, and a decline in the use of lands for agriculture purposes combined to increase dependency on federal food programs. While natives are ensured under federal laws and policies the right to exercise sovereignty over their own jurisdictions, the exercise of self-determination and self-governance interventions have lagged in agriculture due in part to the laws that govern USDA programs. Agriculture still holds the most promise for secure food access and sustainable rural economies in Indian country, but improvements in the law will help create consistencies for program efficiencies and applications throughout USDA. When IC was established, we were tasked with conserving, developing, and promoting Indian resources for the benefit of Indian people while advancing and advocating for tribal sovereignty. Within our lands, there are a number of agriculture endeavors. It ranges from tribal members to individual members with their own agriculture operations, from planting and harvesting to ranching to subsistence farming to tribal government-run ag operations. What we also know is with all those agriculture endeavors, most of the food leaves our communities. It doesn't stay in to feed our own people. And so a lot of the efforts we are engaged in is to help, one, tribal producers, help them navigate USDA programs, help them with their business plans, and then work on policy to support building markets for tribal producers, including federal feeding programs intended specifically for reservations that currently do not procure their food from tribal producers. So we are, to do this work, I'm over our policy and government relations team, which is a smaller and newer formalized team at IEC. The bulk of our work is on the ground is done by a technical assistance network. We have staff, many of whom are also tribal producers themselves, working with their family operations, who they're in regions, and I think there's 12 different regions we've modeled after the regions that reflect the Bureau of Indian Affairs, because almost all of our producers don't just have to engage with USDA, they also have to engage with the Bureau of Indian Affairs at the Department of the Interior, who is actually responsible for all agriculture leases. So we have a framework so that there are individuals on the ground who can go meet with producers and keep them informed about what programs are available, keep them informed about what resources we might be able to help with, sourcing soil testing kits, having some natural resource in-field trainings. But ultimately, all of our TA network is tasked with meeting producers where they are in the words that they are using to describe what their goals are for their operations, and to try and make sure that the programs at USDA are reaching producers in the way that is going to fulfill what that producer wants, not what anyone else is going to tell them is best for them. And so in addition to our TA network, we also have a natural resources department that does a lot of those in-field trainings, and an American Indian Foods program that is tasked with helping tribal producers access different markets. Even with all of this framework, we still encounter a number of challenges. One, this is where I liked hearing some of my colleagues in the room from the Virgin Islands, was getting tribal governments involved to advocate for their producers. We have, every tribe has their own elected government or form of government. And if those elected officials are not familiar with agriculture operations, then it is hard, or it can be challenging, to get them involved in a meaningful way to advocate on behalf of their citizens. And so part of our job is also serving as a translator between our producers and their elected leaders within their tribe, whose advocacy often carries more weight with the federal government because of the existing trust and treaty relationships that are in place with the U.S. Why some of our tribal governments, I think, have that position, it's not just lack of knowledge, but food and ag has been weaponized for to subject tribal people. And so historically, while every tribe had a version of agriculture, every tribe had a way of feeding its people. Food, especially if you look back at the treaties, is mentioned in nearly every treaty, if not every single one of them. And here, if you're agreeing to this, you're also going to take on these farming practices. You need to learn these types of farming. And so the structure around food and food development was set up to keep tribal people on reservations and separating them from their food sources that were regionally and culturally appropriate. And so there's sometimes a hard feeling around the history of agriculture in Indian country. And then we know that we have largely been left out of Farm Bill and USDA programs because we haven't been mentioned in the Farm Bill specifically. And it's important to be mentioned specifically if the area, the region you live in, isn't being accounted for in the programs that are supposed to be serving all of our producers. And so in 2017, IAC joined with two other organizations, the National Congress of American Indians and the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative based out of the University of Arkansas, along with the Shakopee Mid-Wankatoon Sioux community in Minnesota, to form the Native Farm Bill Coalition as an initiative to elevate tribal voices in the Farm Bill, in the lead up to the Farm Bill. It serves as a way to reach out directly to tribal producers for them to inform us about what they want to reach policymakers in DC. And it is comprised of member tribes that have passed resolutions saying they want to be a part of this effort. And it is through those that we host a number of roundtables in the lead up to the Farm Bill, and then have started doing more and more fly-ins, so that in the same room we have producers and tribal leaders speaking with Hill staff. And this year, that's been one of the most fun things that I've been able to witness is that, for instance, in one of our larger fly-ins from the Great Plains, we had some great tribal producers who are ranchers talk about the challenges they're encountering. You know, the drought monitor accounts for may say their neighbor 1 mile away is in drought, but they can't access it because they're in a different county, and it's not based on tribal reservation boundaries or disaster declarations. And he was able to speak to that in a really meaningful and understandable way. And at the end of the week, a tribal leader, a newly elected chairman for a tribe in his state, though not his tribe, went up to him and said, "I'm so glad you were here. I never knew about any of this, but I'm taking away so much more than I knew because you were here." And so your voices as producers are critical to bridging that gap between what's happening on the ground and the policy being made locally, regionally, statewide, and nationally. So that's my spiel. Thanks for being patient with me while I worked through it, but I'm looking forward to hearing my colleagues and from you afterward.
Well, good morning. My name is Jordan Treakle. I work for the National Family Farm Coalition. And for those of you who may be less familiar with NFFC, we are a 33-member coalition from across the country, focusing almost exclusively on federal policy advocacy since 1986. And the Federation is a founding member of NFFC. And the Federation is also the largest member group in our coalition space. So I want to spend a few minutes here talking about, or building off of the opening that Dãnia raised about the importance of centering land in the discussion around rural prosperity and dignified livelihoods and racial justice. And I think we have to acknowledge that land governance is key for all of those things to be achieved. But here I want to just make the clarification at the beginning that when I talk about land, I'm not just talking about land in terms of a natural resource, but more in terms of a community's relationship to the land and the power structures that shape those relationships. So NFFC has always worked closely with the Federation on land issues in our federal policy advocacy, including in the 2018 Farm Bill, where we prioritized standing up the heirs property relending program as one of our main priorities. And land governance is going to continue to be a top priority for NFFC in the 2023 Farm Bill, building off of some of those wins in 2018. So as I talk about land in these few minutes, just wanted to acknowledge that it's impossible to quickly or respectfully summarize the history of land governance in this country and the ongoing violence, displacement, and institutionalized discrimination that are at the foundation of this country, as well as the community resistance and cultural resilience that continues to defend those relationships to land. But I do want to touch on two aspects of this discussion that I believe are too often left out of the policy debate. And we can go to that next slide. So the first point I just want to touch on is that the trend in the privatization of nature and the land consolidation in particular is at a global scale. And how this plays out at the local level and the global level are deeply intertwined. And it's one of those things of you need to follow the money. So NFFC is a founding member of La Via Campesina in North America, which is the largest social movement in the world, consisting of over 200 million farmers and peasants. And it's through these international networks that in 2008, in the wake of the global financial crisis, we began to monitor how U.S. corporations began to essentially test out new forms of land grabbing in communities of color outside the United States. And you can actually go back to that last slide before we transition. Thanks. And it's through these farmer allies in places like Brazil where we began to see and continue to see an entirely new industry of speculative land investment in farmland and large-scale agribusiness just explode. And I use that term explode figuratively and literally. There have been an enormous increase globally in assassinations of land defenders, displacements of Black and brown communities abroad, and ecological destruction driven by U.S. corporations and U.S. financing. So this is a global trend that is obviously felt most immediately in our local communities here in the U.S. and abroad, but it requires a national and an international policy response to address. We can't do this alone. And when we think about racial equity in the context of land and land rights, we have to consider the racial impacts of land grabbing beyond the U.S. borders, particularly when U.S. corporations and U.S. financial investments are responsible for those human rights abuses. We have to build a global movement of resistance that transcends state and national borders to achieve a more equitable model for land governance. So the second element I want to touch on here is that we've witnessed this speculative land investment trend and land consolidation trend that started out in 2008 abroad has come to the U.S., and we anticipated that. And we can go to that next slide. So this is a map that shows where trillions of dollars of investment are coming from, and those are the places in green, and where they're being invested. Those are places in yellow and in places in green. And places in red are really just where money is going. It's not accepting money for land investment. So just to give a global snapshot. So you can go to that next slide. So the number of institutionally owned properties in the US rose threefold from 2009 to 2022, while their market value increased from under $2 billion to over $14 billion in that same period. And US pension funds in particular have been leading the charge in this land investment trend through their subsidiaries. And one of those leading corporate entities is the Teachers Insurance and Annuity Association, or TIAA, which alone owns over 340,000 acres in the US. And this is a map of the regions where they are invested, a little bit of explanation out there on the side. I want to be clear that these corporate investments are not about growing food for people. It's a model for harvesting profit off the backs of working people. And the corporations are very clear about this. They explicitly say to the media out loud that they are not interested in the production practices, or for that matter, the livelihoods of the people stewarding the land. They say that they're only interested in extracting value off the land through rents, land appreciation, and the financial safety nets that are provided by USDA. So farmland in this context is a commodified asset for investment. It's a place to park financial resources regardless of the social, cultural, or ecological values of those people who call that land and that community where that land is their home, or how they choose to use that land. So that is to say that corporate land ownership is rewriting power structures in rural America. And this is a major concern if we look at the history of contract agriculture, particularly for farmers of color. We look at the poultry industry. When farmers are forced into contracts, that often does not work out well for the farmer. Now, some parts of the U.S. have had laws on the books for more than a century that try to keep farmland in the hands of farmers and local communities. But the reality is that the federal government has basically been asleep at the wheel on this issue since the 1970s. There hasn't been any meaningful federal land laws for regulating corporations buying up rural America since 1978. And unlike since the 1970s, corporations are now investing billions of dollars in farmland, and they're using complex and opaque shell companies to hide these transactions. And they're using predatory tactics to target farmers in crisis. And that's particularly a threat, we think, to farmers who are on heirs property, as one example. And you'll notice that Mississippi is a state that is attracting a lot of investment, and there are a lot of heirs property owners in that state. So land prices, farmer debt, and land consolidation are all at historic highs. And these are conditions that benefit corporate investors, but are systemic threats to our rural economies and our food systems. And it's time for Congress, in a bipartisan manner, to address this in the Farm Bill. And you can go to the next slide. So I'm just going to close by highlighting a report that we just released in collaboration with the Federation and the University of California at Santa Cruz that consisted of some deep community interviews with Federation members in Mississippi that examine these trends I've just highlighted in the Delta, and attempts to both amplify the voices of Black farmers about these impacts of these corporate land investments, and also build the case for federal policy reform on this issue in the Farm Bill. So you may see a familiar face on that tractor. Please do check out the report and help us amplify it, and let's work together to get this issue into the Farm Bill. Thank you.
That was a lot. I'm like, I don't know what they want me to say after that. And the reason is I had slides, and I chose not to use them because the Farm Bill at its heart is about people. And focusing on the people becomes really important when we're trying to build a supermajority. So first of all, I want you all to take a moment to think about an ancestor, whether collectively or individually, whose legacy you sit here on. And then I want you to position that next to someone who you care enough about that you want to give them a better world to live in. That is where we have to come to navigate our difference. I am Sommer Sibilly-Brown. In 1978, I was born, so that policy is 45 years old because I'm a 45-year-old Virgin Islander, Black, Caribbean, African, American, mixed intersection human who suffers with or that stressed out version of what Dr. Christopher said. So I am insulin resistant. I was like, oh my God, that's me. That's me up there, not in data, in real. Here I am, the food system advocate who doesn't grow food but has the honor of representing Dale Brown, Yvette Brown, Ronil Alembert, Badu Christophan, and Raymond Armstrong, who are in the room, but there are 565 other people in the Virgin Islands who've been doing this way longer than I can count, but they couldn't make it on the plane, right? And so when I think about that, it's also thinking about all the ways this intersects just in me, in my being. What is the world that we're building, and my curiosity now around how do we build this supermajority? I run an organization called Virgin Islands Good Food Coalition, not because I was trained in it or went to school with it. I had 16 little people in a multi-age classroom do a project on how youth could really get involved in agriculture, and we found the National Farm to School Network, and my student Denver said to me, Miss Sibley, if we's a part of the US, how come the Virgin Islands ain't there on the map? And I was just like, great question, that's what our project's about. But that curiosity of why the Virgin Islands isn't on the map led to me harassing Dale and Yvette. And so, you know, like when we stand here and we come to these places where you get mics, I didn't get the mic alone, right? Because Dale and Yvette became, their lived experience became the reference, the almanac point, the things that I began learning with and being able to articulate the struggles, but not just, at first it was about like production struggles, right? And how we get more food to people. But then I was like, oh wait, this is my struggle. I embody the struggle of not having access to real food. And if we love our children and our children's children, the only gift we really can give them and guarantee is health, right? If they wake up in the morning, then they're ready for the fight, but we ain't ready for the fight because we can't wake up in the morning because we're insulin resistant. Because I have polycystic ovarian syndrome and I'm 45 and I want to have children, but is that possible? And oh, my father went to Vietnam and then we got a letter saying that he might have been exposed to Agent Orange, which then makes me unable to have children. So it's not just the obesity and it's not just the addiction to sugar, which is still a subset of our enslavement. And I don't even have a representative in Congress. Well, we have a delegate and she does a kick-ass job and there's memes with like capes and stuff. And I'm super proud that Delegate Stacy Plaskett represents us, but there is nobody in Senate on my behalf. There is nobody saying and thinking about me unless you all are thinking about me. And so 175 years ago in 1848, the people of the Virgin Islands, the descendants of the enslaved West Africans who came to the Virgin Islands, they had a revolt and they took their freedom. 1848. 1917, we were sold to the United States. 1848, 1917. I don't understand how we were granted our freedom. Well, we took it, but then, you know, Governor von Scholten had to declare it. He was tried in Denmark. Women were burned at the stake and told that they were witches because that was a successful revolt after being proclaimed free. And in 1917, America purchases us. In 1954, there is a revised Organic Act because in 1920, there's a mass citizenship where everybody wears white, there's really beautiful photographs, and yet still I don't have a representation in the United States, and I'm not included in U.S. history. Wow. Right? How many people in here know where the U.S. Virgin Islands is? We are 45 minutes south of Puerto Rico on that beautiful slide that Jordan had up there. We were the missing colored in parts. And, you know, when Dr. Christopher was talking about the hierarchy of value that we have put on human life, this equity journey has also become the hierarchy of oppression that people are in. So it really makes it hard when you're living steeped in trauma, when you get your moment to consider who else. Who isn't there? Who else is suffering? Who is the invisible of the marginalized? And so, you know, the smiley face emoji that has the dots? That's the Virgin Islands. We are, but it's not just us. It's Puerto Rico, it's Guam, it's Northern Mariana, it is Alaska, it is Hawaii, these isolated island geographic areas that have quote unquote U.S. citizenship, and in my case, because we are unincorporated, means that Congress has decided only certain parts of the U.S. Constitution applies to me, because we're using I statements, so I can't be president, and I don't have a representative, so I gotta come and find you all and beg you all to care about my scenario enough to make your state person care. And the USDA just had an equity commission. The closest thing to a representative on that equity commission was a person who has Puerto Rican descent. So in the equity conversation, if we're actually not centering the invisible, and that talks about people in Appalachia, that talks about, you know, indigenous peoples who are living in Indian country on their land, right? That talks about, it's not just about the Virgin Islands. We are like the hyper microwaved extreme. But right here, in the United States, there are populations of people who are invisible. And it is our job, my job, Good Food's job, to make this conversation so normal that you don't have to have a degree to have it. Because right now, the food conversation and the farm bill conversation requires you to be Dr. So-and-so with 6 labels behind your name for people to say that your lived experience is valid, and that's not true. My lived experience is valid because food is a right, and I should not have to choose between that right and my voice and who gets to speak on my behalf. Like it's all of these things that are in the fallacy of power that is dominant and feels really real because we keep playing in their system. So how I got to this place in my work is that we have very limited land. I live on 84 square miles. And if y'all didn't know, it rained oil 2 years ago. What? Yeah, it rained oil. So when we talk about the impact of corporations, and that oil rained on most of our farmland, Mid-Island going west. Nobody knows, right? Like we're fighting for water. We were at a meeting. Mr. Alambert was at the meeting. We were with our Department of Agriculture. And he came to the meeting with one question. What are we doing about drought? What are we doing about the fact that we're going to need water to grow food? What are we doing about the care? He kept saying pollinators in the room because pollinators matter and they're dying at an alarming rate. And so when we look at the impacts of climate, when we look at the impacts that we have to wait in order to get drought relief for a federal designation that is not going to come because we don't have the same drought monitor. And this is happening at alarming rates while dealing with COVID after 2017, Maria. So we have been in continuous traumatic disorder, right? The weaponized piece is really important. Just because we're not in active warfare like Ukraine does not mean that we're not in active war. Right? We think because we get to go to the grocery store without a bomb exploding, that they're not these silent, invisible bombs that are exploding in our communities every day that make it really hard for us and for our food producers to survive. Food producers live under amazing amounts of stress. Most of them don't have health care. Where's the Farm Bill on health care for the people who are providing food for us? There are these. So that extreme and opposite, when she said it, it's so true to me. And I'm like, my expertise is in my own humanity, right? That's where I'm an expert. My expertise is in living life in my community. And I'm trying to figure out in this curiosity as we have this space together, how do we center the Farm Bill around people? Yes. Access to capital is important. The environment in which we grow food is important, right? Healthcare for people is important. A system is predicated on its smallest actor. The farmer is an individual system actor that if they are not healthy, then the whole system is going to collapse because a system is a network of actors. We have to look at the smallest unit of work and begin to seriously support it. I had a breakfast conversation, and I'm going to close with this because the ancestors fired me up with all this brilliant conversation. I was like, oh my gosh, I hope I don't get too radical because there's this thing about being solemn and irreverent at the same time that we have to hold. We actually have to not give to the rest of that statement, while having reverence for those who are doing the work on our behalf, making sure that we are respecting and honoring people, and also saying that doesn't have to be true anymore, because I'm not going to fight you for scraps at your table when we can build a whole new table, and I know a whole bunch of people with all the skill necessary to do it. We have to practice decolonizing ourselves at a rapid pace to prove to the people, the opposites who say it's not true, that no, it actually is true because the Federation of Southern Cooperatives is doing it, right? And if you speak to Jordan, they're doing it. There's people with facts, information, and practices that can show you the equity that we seek can involve repair and reimagining and a redistribution of wealth that will make this entire nation stronger, better. Like, we can do that. We can do that. And the fact that the truth is the world is becoming a darker place at the rates in which we are falling in love with each other and becoming different kinds of people. It's not just black people and white people and Chinese people, and the world is becoming more co-aligned. And so we just got to go with that flow and understand that that co-alignment comes with different versions of lived stories. So sometimes the people in co-alignment are going to get it wrong, because they didn't grow up where I grew up. So they may say something that I find offensive, but if I don't have the gall and the compassion to tell that person, hey, you just offended me, I'm gonna give you some grace and let's talk through this, then they will continue to win and the opposite will take us over. So I'm Sommer Sibilly-Brown. Thank you for letting me get on my soapbox.
Listen, when I tell you, when we were planning this session in particular, I had a vision of what I thought this could look like, and this is beyond my wildest dream of what this could be. And, you know, Sommer shared something and Dr. Christopher shared something. My entry point to this work is racial disparities in health outcomes. And I was specifically interested in disparities in maternal mortality rates. And from that, I was very, very interested in why Black women have the maternal health outcomes that we have. So my whole journey into advocacy around access to land and access to the resources that we need to be good stewards and to grow our own foods led me to personal choices that I made. I was a raw vegan preparing my body to have my daughter. And I still had to end up spending 2 weeks in the hospital after she was born. I'm a law school educated Black, Chinese, Jamaican immigrant woman in this country with a deep understanding of institutionalized racism, so much so that I was a member of a CSA and shopping at my local farmers markets and my local farms. And yet that racism, that historic racism that dehumanized us so much that the relationships, I was struck by each of you talking about people and land in ways that we don't hear discussed when we talk about policy. When Jordan talked about commodifying the land, you know, everything Sommer said, you know, but when Abby talks, but when Abby was talking about their community having that potential for agricultural production, and yet knowing that they did not have the access to the resources, and this is with the data to back it up. I mean, that has to show you that this history that we have been sold, this narrative that we have been sold, like Dr. Christopher said, we have to start with the truth because our bodies, our humanity is bearing the burden of that. And so I just want to invite the panelists to share some of your reflections because you all did a really good job of mirroring following the rules. I know that you wanted to jump in and amplify things that each of you were saying, but what were some of your reflections as you were listening to your co-presenters? What were some of the themes, especially around the way the history and the language and the Farm Bill, the narrative that is used that dehumanizes us and removes the land from the reality of what it is and makes it a commodity?
I'll jump in. One thing that when Jordan was talking about the heirs property issues, and especially with land speculation being predatory in nature, that has happened before. And that is why we have highly fractionated Indian lands. And so it wasn't, I was talking with a few different folks in here, you know, it wasn't until a couple of years ago that one of the tools used to actually make Indian land available was finally fixed. So, you know, at the turn of the century, 1900s, during the allotment era, Congress passed a statute that if an Indian, this was only specific to what people like to call the 5 civilized, they're just the 5 large tribes in Oklahoma. If you were a tribal member and you fell below a certain blood quantum, your land came out of trust and then it was open for sale. So like with my own family, my great grandma's land fell out of trust. my great grandfather married her because she had land, and then sold off half of it. And so there is a model and a framework for that happening because it did happen. And so that law was finally amended to stop that automatic loss of trust land based on a blood quantum status. I think it was 2 or 3 years ago. It was the Stigler Act Amendment. And it took somebody like Congressman Cole, who's Chickasaw, while he isn't the Chickasaw representative, it is his district in Oklahoma who elected him. It was important to especially Oklahoma and the 5 tribes and the people who that's tied to. So I'd be interested to see how, knowing what will happen, how taking some of those lessons or some of that data might be transferred to efforts in the Farm Bill and the heirs property issues.
Abby, can you just define blood quantum for us for those who may not be familiar with that term?
Sure. So if you're a member of a federally recognized tribe, you have a blood quantum, and it is listed on your card. So I have a CDIB card, which is your certificate of Indian blood that the federal government tracks, and then I have my tribal membership. But every tribe can decide its own membership. That's been established by the Supreme Court. And so for my tribe, we're lineal descent. You are a proven direct descendant of an original enrollee. But there are other tribes who have adopted that blood quantum membership, and that's not for me to say or take a position on, but where you have to have a minimum amount of some type of Indian blood. And tribes do it differently, but that didn't exist prior to the 1800s in some of the treaties that was used to lessen the responsibility that the government owed under the terms of the treaty if you could distill out or weed out people because the way they were deemed not to have enough Indian, even if that's the community that they were in and never left. So it's still very relevant today for every tribal member because all of us have that on track with the federal government.
Well, 2 things. One, when Abby discussed the relationship that Indigenous members or tribal members have with food production, and the difficulty because of the ways that policy weaponized and stigmatized growing food. I think we find that in the next generations coming up of the Virgin Islands. We view farming, or I believe that we view farming, I'm trying to follow the rules, right? I believe that farming is viewed as poor people's work, uneducated people's work. We see it in the way the Virgin Islands school system determines who gets ag classes. They don't see the STEM math application, right? And it's because I believe as a nation, we have hidden food under really great marketing. And then when Jordan was talking about how quickly land is being scraped up, right, and commodified, I think about disaster, right? Because after every disaster, we use large tracts of agricultural farmland for development. It is the guise of not investing in existing structures, but we need now, right now after the hurricanes and with COVID, we have $8 billion. And a lot of that land is saying that we have housing shortages, right? But we also then say that we lost a significant portion of our population. So if we lose a significant portion of our population, why wouldn't we just fix existing properties, right? Blight properties, and move people into those instead of taking land that is meant for agriculture and putting on it what we now deem as more modern, culturally inappropriate structures. So the disaster capitalism is to me a subset of it. And when we look at how climate change is increasing, and you know, people might not want to call it climate change, so let's talk about more extreme weather. The Virgin Islands is not the only community that is experiencing more extreme weather. So when that federal recovery dollar comes in, it's an excuse to take more land and do something different under the guise of helping people, not looking at the long-term consequence. We're in the middle of trauma, right? We are all busy dealing with our loss, that it happened so quickly, and then the next thing you know, you've lost another third of your community. So those two things really stood out to me.
And Sommer, just to amplify and build on the idea you shared, there are Black farmers in Tennessee. When you talk about disaster, you know, you're talking about the weather change, the natural disasters, but these disasters created by corporate capitalist greed that has so extracted from communities their own control of the ways that they can provide for themselves, that we have plants and you know, in Tennessee there are Black farmers who are currently experiencing their land being taken, some of which is under the government's taking powers, so that economic development can come into those areas. And so there are both constructed and natural disasters that are used as the excuse to take land away from us.
So many connections here. A few things that are percolating for me is thank you so much for highlighting that element of the story around land, and really want to underline the importance of learning those lessons that have around how we interact with the federal government around issues and that deep institutionalized racism, and build and learn from that experience. I wanted to mention in my presentation that as these U.S. corporations are experimenting with these new forms of contracts abroad, that means that we have a decade's worth of stories of resistance to learn from those communities abroad that we can bring home and build upon. Those stories are also here in our communities, and we need to integrate those. So thank you for highlighting that. So much that was said about how different parts of the country are pitted against each other in a race to the bottom because there may not be equal representativity in our government is so relevant to this discussion around mainland U.S., where most land discussions are regulated at the state level. And we have a history of political mobilization in the early 1900s that have some of these state laws that have been under attack, they have been weakened, they are not enough, but they do provide some foundation, legal foundation for resisting corporations buying up land. But that's 12 states or so, and they're mostly in the Midwest. How do we build a multi-state, multi-territory international movement that we're learning those lessons from and speaking in collaboration with our allies who don't have that same kind of political power in our government? And also, as again, reforming federal law to bring us up to a fair standard, a fair foundation. It doesn't mean we get rid of the ability of states to regulate land in some ways, but we need a higher foundation, baseline that is centered around equity. And I think that we're in that moment, and that is a complex legal and advocacy question to unwind, particularly when we're talking about places like the U.S. Virgin Islands. But I think this is the moment where we need to start pushing into those discussions.
I want to say yes, and my brain is moving 50 miles an hour, but there's an important something that I think as we have this conversation needs to be brought, the spirit of it, right, is as we look at, or as I am using my lens to look at the Farm Bill and what solutions we can come up with, one of the questions I have for myself is who am I centering, and how am I, in the solutions I seek, not forwarding oppression on other communities, right? Because the reference to the TIA, right, they're trying to build a safety net for people who do, quote unquote, a lot of good work, right? Teachers matter, they hold our children, and they are also underpaid and underserved. Our answers can't forward oppression on other peoples, even if they don't live in our nation. And so some of it is what we don't see, we don't attend to. And I hope that I can hold that lens consistently in this room. And as we leave, may my answers not be oppressive to others. Like, enough vision, to take that in.
So y'all are up. Oh, so I'll recognize I'll recognize Bobby Wilson.
I'm not sure whether I want to add to the conversation where I got one finger up or where I got 1.5 fingers up. Are we not caught between a double-edged sword? And what I see is, as I make preparation to go before the Senate to talk about the Farm Bill, I'm a little bit confused because I had a great conversation talking about the Conservation Stewardship Program coming down here. That Conservation Stewardship Program is designed to keep land in farming. And the government will pay you to put that land in farming. Then on the other hand, the government turn around and take your land away from you under the means of a disaster or some other means that they want to take it away from you. So in my mind, I'm confused with a double-edged sword. That's I don't know. How do we address that issue, if we can address it?
Before you sit, could you please just share for the group your name and your organization that you're representing today?
My name is Bobby Wilson. I'm with Metro Atlanta Urban Farm, founder, 3271 Main Street in College Park, Georgia. And we operate a 5-acre naturally grown certified facility.
Thank you. I think y'all should hazard a response.
So a sugar cane blade that walk like a double-edged sword, right? So when you cut down a cane field, both sides of it, the sickle goes both ways. I think it's something that Abby shared. It's that targeted approach of naming exactly how we want that program to function. So it's putting a check on making sure the Farm Bill has language around land preservation, disaster response, land retention, and ensuring that the programs that they are using to help people keep land in farming are expanded upon and name critically, critically underserved communities as priorities, right? So we use their structure to ensure that the language at least makes that that double-edged sword useful to us.
I don't think I have anything to add, except that I think in considering those structures, we need to also look who has had access to those programs in the past, and what needs to happen in terms of targeting and outreach so folks have the option to engage in those programs as they see fit. I know that for CSP, it is consistently over-enrolled. And there is a political reason why those programs are being underfunded. It's not that farmers don't want them. They're not getting the outreach to particularly communities of color who could benefit from them, and they're not being funded to the level that farmers need them. So I think that's a really important consideration when we talk about exactly what Sommer said.
The other thing that I would add to that is that we have to always keep focused on the illusion of power. I think that concept of a double-edged sword is rooted in the scarcity mindset that has been created by policy decisions. Because if you go, several of the remarks went back to the 1900s, and as soon as I hear that, I think about 1910, the height of African-American land ownership. And I think about, the resettlement communities. I think of the policy decisions that were made under the auspices of giving African Americans access to land, but in the implementation of those programs, there were intentional decisions to afford that land to white folks. So when the government's really good at redistributing wealth amongst the white community, and we've seen the successes that result from the government making abundance amongst the white community. Because to whom much has been given, much wealth has been doubled over. Many learnings have come from the government making those investments, right? So I don't think that it's that our government or our political will isn't there to create programs that secure access to land to folks who want to grow good food. I think it really does come back to this anti-Black racism, anti-Native racism that is always in the mix of the implementation of government programs, just like when the IRA EQIP money came down in March. And March 1st, it was announced, and Mississippi's closing date was March 14th, March 17th, right? So it's not that the Inflation Reduction Act didn't have tons and tons of resources available for conservation, for CSP conservation and EQIP in particular, but it was in the implementation of those programs that, and even the selection of which programs would be covered by CSP and EQIP funding. Those are the intentional decisions that come through the implementation of policy. That's why advocacy never ends. It's not just about making sure there's enough language to protect these excluded communities. It's also in the appropriations and also in the rulemaking, and then all the way down to the local level implementation. And so I think that if we look at it from the perspective of, we have lots of good example of this government redlining and excluding people of color from having that access, we can see those positive net outcomes amongst white folks and show them that where there's a will, there's a way, right? I see a hand in the back. That's an adding. Good use of hand gestures, by the way.
Yes, and building on that, I'm glad to hear the piece of self-sufficiency and sovereignty in this. I think it's very important, particularly in looking at coffee and from a coffee perspective. There's research from the University of Michigan that indicates that resistance to climate change and climate impacts are most from a access to capital perspective and not from capital climate implementation projects being forced onto farmers and people. And so I think, I'm glad to hear the access to capital piece, the self-sufficiency support piece. And I would like to hear any thoughts on alliances with the TIAA for teachers who, I'm sure they're unaware where their retirement money and pension funds are coming from. It could be a great alliance.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's a really important point, and I'm really glad that it was set out at the beginning that we do not see teachers who deserve a pension as the enemy here. And we have done, over the last years, a lot of outreach to teacher associations, primarily at universities, to educate them about how their pension funds are being invested in agriculture. And almost all of them do not know that this dynamic is happening. They're not familiar with agriculture, they're not being informed by TIAA. So I would say that 98% of the time when we bring a farmer to a faculty at a university and explain this dynamic, we have very strong support from those teachers, and we've been very encouraged to see those teachers organizing Senate faculty resolutions at their university calling on TIAA to divest from agricultural land. That to me is farmer worker solidarity. That is needed. And so I think we have 14 Senate faculty resolutions across the country now. I'll also say that we have been building bridges with the fossil fuel divestment community because TIA is also heavily invested in fossil fuels because there is a common fight there. And just as we hear oil getting sprayed across the Virgin Islands and that undermining livelihoods and agriculture there, we don't think that most of the teachers who are in our classrooms support that. So there's a lot of organizing work to be done with workers, with teachers. And just to say that a major source of funding for TIA and these other pension funds are from public employees. So fire departments, police officers, and it's not just in the US. So the Dutch public employee pension fund system is heavily invested in TIA, which is then funding displacement of rural communities in Brazil. So there's this complex map of financial flows that is predicated on workers not being informed and pitting workers and farmers against each other.
I just want to invite others who have questions that when you do get the mic, if you could introduce yourself and the group that you're representing, please.
Hi, yes, I'm Tiffany Belfield Elamine. I am a Black farmer from the state of Kentucky. I work for Community Farm Alliance. I'm the food system equity organizer there, and I'm also standing as director as the Kentucky Black Farmers Association. I just want to say, sister, whew, people that know me knows that we on the same frequency, and I appreciate how in these spaces with Federation that we always bring it back to ancestral land, to the spirit, because this is a work that's bigger than us, and as most of us are here on an ancestral, spiritual frequency, we speak when we need to speak, right? But I'm going to very much so stay like I'm supposed to. So I wanted to come back to the small actors saying, like the small acting conversation, right? So for the state of Kentucky, the biggest thing, and also going into how we talked about like all these funds from disasters, they go back into these, for us it's Eastern Kentucky, it goes right back into Eastern Kentucky, but you don't fix the systems that, we're flooded and we don't have no food and we don't have accessibility to clean water when these things happen, and then you drop all these millions of dollars and FEMA for the nonprofits and the people who are organizing, but then I'm still myself, Tiffany, taking food from Central Kentucky on my own foot and going to East Kentucky. And there's probably 0.5% of Black people down there. I'm not going down there because I'm trying to help people to look like me. I'm helping people because, as everybody says, this is this is a holistic situation. But then, I think like, well, where's all those millions of dollars? And then you're bringing them trash stuff anyways that's already messing with their health, their mentality, that they think that they're being helped, but they're not. And then it even goes back to, the whole USDA and the farm, the IRA and everything like that. There was this call to action for the floods, right? There was this call to action when the tornado came through West Kentucky. But then when you're talking about less than 2% of all of the farming population is Black, and then we get smacked with, oh, you're going to get help, but you're not going to get help. We got a farmer in the back. I'm speaking as I, but we. He had a USDA loan. He may not speak, but I'm going to put it out there. We had 5 farmers in the whole state that were Black that had those loans. It was not considered a crisis when they told us that they ain't going to pay for them. What do they do next? There was no risk management for it. You know what I'm saying? But then all these funds is coming down, and there's a question behind this. All these funds are coming down for equity and NRCS and, all this stuff, but then you have to have all these, even if you're an individual, you got to be validated in some way to help. So you're giving it back for the state of Kentucky as sitting on some of these tables. You see the same people getting the funding, the same universities, the same nonprofits for the state of Kentucky. As I sat on the table, that is a white table. So even when you're telling me you're helping socially disadvantaged in the state of Kentucky, the majority is white women getting help. So then for us, what do we do as the black farmer, less than percent, we don't have numbers. We're trying to build power and capacity. It's like you're giving millions of dollars to the state. But who is getting that money? And what do we do? And my question to that, and it's not necessarily a question that needs to be answered, but it's a question that I've already been here to DC with black farmers, and we all had those conversations sitting in our senator's office, Mitch McConnell, and we went and talked to Cory Booker's office. Thank you. Yeah, y'all pray for us. No shade, but it is what it is, and it's there. The truth is written. But it's like, how do you change where the money's going to? How do you audit? Because our HBCU, yeah, I mean, people that know me. I talk about it. Our HBCU ag department is ran by white people. Our HBCU, we have one in the whole state. You feel me? So when you're saying, oh yeah, all this stuff for racial stuff is coming, it's going to the HBCU, it may look good for Alabama, it may look good for Georgia, but in Kentucky, that doesn't help me. So then we are creating, and that's what we did do, organizational power to then write these grants and then try to get this money, right? But the question is that when we go to have this congressional briefing, we're having these conversations with our lawmakers, I don't know how to put it in words that there needs to be an accountability on where your funds are going and how much of that is actually going to people of color. So that's the biggest thing. And this a side note, the blood serum thing, like the blood quantum thing, just a back note, I always think, is that the reason why black people don't get reparations? Like, how do you get blood tests to tell if you are black enough, if your people really came from Virginia or not, if your people really were slaves? As mulatto people were listed on the slave docket, natives were listed on the slave docket. Like how, you know, so I just wanted to put that in the back of the ear, and that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Greetings, everyone. This is a great segue. My name is Molly Beavers. Whew. I'm very happy to be here with you all today. I have a few open-ended questions and a series of comments just to bring things into context, okay? So my first silly question is, have you ever heard the story of the guy who sold the Eiffel Tower twice? It wasn't his to sell. He put up a sign next to it with his number, said, call me if you want to buy the Eiffel Tower. He managed to sell it twice, but it was never his to sell. And I think of it as a very funny story until I realize that it's happening every day, right? Okay, so, sure, I can stand. I then recognize that knowing who we are increases our sense of power and self-worth, right? So, have you ever seen the movie Pocahontas? Okay, who's seen it as an adult? Okay, it's very hard to get through it as an adult. And now when I watch it, I'm like, okay, wait, she kind of looks kind of like me and a lot of people I know. Yet, when I look at photos, or at least more recent photos of like our tribes, especially the ones that are recognized or the people that are members of these tribes, we don't necessarily see a lot of folks that look like us, right? So I'm thinking about, oh, hi. Okay, I'm gonna definitely turn this way. I think about certain points in history, right? And things that I've learned about, and I wanna give like a quick timeline of just a few things. And I'm from Georgia. I represent the Georgia Women in Agriculture and several other things that I will leave. And in 1828, there was this thing called the Georgia Gold Rush. Has anyone ever heard of the Georgia Gold Rush? I know we've all heard of the Cali Gold Rush. Well, the Cali Gold Rush happened in 1849, whereas Georgia's was in 1828, okay? Now, in 1830, there was a very infamous act that a lot of us know about, the Indian Removal Act of 1830, okay? Now, what some of this act said, and this isn't verbatim, but it said, if you consider yourself Indian, then you gotta go. You got to leave Georgia. If you want to stay in Georgia, then you need to either marry a white person or you need to reclassify yourself as black or a Negro, which led to maybe almost 200 years. Yeah, 2028 will be 200 years, which led to almost, 2030, 200 years of us kind of thinking that we're black, most of us. Now, another number that I'll throw out is that on the slave trade, there were only about 200,000 people that came. Yet, when colonizers arrived, there were about 55 million people here already that had been here for about 20,000 years. And they kind of mentioned smallpox and that, smallpox killed a lot of the native indigenous population. However, apparently it only killed less than half, like way less than half. So we're still looking at like 27 million people that were here that look like us. Any number of us. And so then I find out that maybe in the 1300s, the first people to ever come and colonize the Americas were the Dogon tribe of Mali from Africa. So Africans were already trading with the native people here in the Americas. And so a lot of us were here, period, okay? So that particular set of knowledge alone should let us know that there's a whole lot more power in all of us, right? Okay, so from 1830, we had the Homestead Acts of 1862, which is where we had our land redistributed, right? And I had to really put it all in together with the context of the Georgia Gold Rush, because if we were already being colonized since 1700s and everybody was living together relatively peacefully, but not, I'm like, what triggered them to say, okay, all y'all gotta go? And I'm like, it's because they found the gold. They started finding gold, and it's like, you can look it up. People being like, it's gold in them mountains up there. It's gold in the rivers here. So, okay, great. I'm gonna just fast forward. Because I recognize now that if my grandma never told me that I'm Cherokee and Muskogee, I would never know. Or Blackfoot. And so, and even the term Blackfoot being a term that the colonizers gave us and if you go back, I had to go to the Ocmulgee Mounds to find this out. That's in Macon, Georgia. If you read everything that's there, you're going to find out all the different names, Creek, Blackfoot, that we were given by colonizers, as opposed to our original names that we, if you're going around saying you're Blackfoot in Georgia, you're not going to find out or even be able to become a member of one of these tribes, right? Okay, so like a trail of breadcrumbs that lead you the wrong way entirely, right? So knowing who we are is so important. And I consider several solutions. I did have some questions for our sister here on the Intertribal Council. One of those questions being like, do you think that Native people who have no idea, or maybe they're not a member of a tribe right now, how can we sit on these councils as well and advocate for ourselves as farmers, as Native people who aren't necessarily, or, have been like socially taken away from those titles? That's kind of a question. And then it's not a question, it's a real question. All right. And then I want to offer some solutions. And one of them, directly to my sister here from the Virgin Islands, I'm like, if the Virgin Islands needs water and it's an island, and I know it's all salt water that's surrounding the island, but I also know that desalination stations are very cost effective and cheap to build. How can we implement more of those on the island? And then my final piece of offering is knowing that pre-colonization, let's go back to the 1600s. If we were already trading amongst each other and doing the things, growing the food, how do we reset the dial in a way where we just start back doing it? Like the Intertribal Council, you guys could trade together right now. There's nothing to stop us, unless there is. I need to know what that is, because I have these conversations a lot. I'm like, why aren't we just doing it? So that's where I am. Those little blockades that are like real yet imaginary. How do we act like they don't exist and just do the work anyways? All right. Thanks, guys.
I'll take on or try to take on at least a little bit of the first question, and some of it is going to be an I don't have an answer with respect to how any tribal council works. Even with my tribe, I can't speak for my tribe because I'm one member and I'm not an elected official. In fact, my tribe and our constitution has a blood quantum requirement to be on council. It's not for citizenship, but for elected leadership. I wouldn't be able to. What would have to change in that respect, at least with my tribe, is that it would take a constitutional change for recognition of different voices that aren't viewed in that as a member with within the existing lineal descent. It would take a vote of the people and a majority vote for a constitutional change. Again, every tribe is different in terms of the laws that govern, but as far as how to become involved in those councils, many of them would take some form of constitutional change, which again, a lot of tribes adopted constitutions as a means to try and stave off encroachment. It was especially in the Southeast and Georgia. While not a perfect response, obviously, it probably didn't work as they wanted. Was, hey, we'll create a government that looks similar to yours, so you see we actually can do this and you'll leave us alone. And yet removal still happened. And so then since that era, since the 1830s, many tribal constitutions have changed, but it takes that kind of effort of the existing membership to push for that change. And we've seen some of it, especially in Oklahoma. I think, and again, I can't speak for them because I am not a tribal member of like Muskogees and Seminoles, where you do have all of our, and not just them, all of our tribes have freedmen members. And there have been some of those tribes that have taken on those efforts to amend their constitution or create changes so that there is equality even among the freedmen members within the right to vote in the tribe and the right to participate as a full tribal member, because they came with our members and oftentimes in a form of slavery to existing members. And so it's not to say that it's impossible. It just takes that kind of what has been talked about a lot here, is that super majority of people who can influence that change doing so. So really not a perfect answer. I wish I had a better one, but that's kind of the best way I know to respond to it generally.
So no perfect answers on this panel, but I have two thoughts. One about the desalination. We have 3 large desalination plants in the Virgin Islands that desalinate about 1 million gallons of water a day. And they take that 1 million gallons of water and they throw it back into the ocean. Corporations own the desalination plants, right? The cost to import, build, run, and manage a desalination plant, while it is relatively easy modern technology, is not, again, the barrier is access to those resources, those skills for everyday lay people who need the water. So to your point, when we talk about what can we reimagine in the boundaries of the false power, they own the equipment, and all it really needs is a water truck and relationships with producers who need water during drought, and it's not happening. So when Dale posed the question, in a very small community, when the person forwarding systemic oppression shares your exact reflection, those conversations become really fractured and hard, because in the United States, as I understand it, when we have conversations about equity or oppression, right, and there's a Healing and Reconciliation Council, we're talking about, it's usually people looking across racial lines. Even though it's a socioeconomic conversation, that conversation on its face appears to be a white-black conversation. In the Virgin Islands, it appears to be me versus you, which then devolves into you had never liked me anyway. Oh, that person don't like my family. It becomes really, really, really personal. People can't hear the issue. We don't see the systemic oppression because we understand racism to be something that happens between black people and white people, and we black people and black people. So the problem can't be race. The problem can't be that we have internalized our decolonization. The problem can't be that we never built our own government. The problem can't be that Sommer is excluding people, that we don't have to check ourselves on how we show up in the programming of systemic oppression as its stewards, because we have that work to do amongst ourselves as well. And in the Virgin Islands, that is alive and well. We throw 3 million gallons of water a day, period. To the second point, you talk about when you said, well, why can't we just get back to the doing? I was in a virtual conference and we were talking about reparations to Indigenous people, and I froze. My gut, my fear, my panic as a woman of color in that conversation froze. I said, well, damn, if we're afforded 40 acres and a mule, but they give them back all the land that was theirs that they never had to give away, where does my 40 acres and a mule for reparations come in? Because they don't got nothing to give me because it wasn't theirs in the first place. So how does that immediately pit Indigenous needs and rights and their reparation against my reparation as a woman of color, because what you promised me really was theirs, so it's not yours to give away? So are you going to take me on a boat and put me back to where you think you got me from in Africa for the people to not recognize me? And there is no such thing as secondary indigeneity that we're talking about. So all of the indigenous people in the Virgin Islands was wiped out. So how do I ever claim any indigenous decolonization activities if my ancestors came here about 300 years ago, but they're not from here? So I actually don't even know where I'm from, right? So I say that to say that in this newness that is emerging and we're building, we actually have to acknowledge that there is a pitfall, because what can we really repair that is fair to the existing group of humans and humanity that have invested and built the wealth of this nation? And what do we actually need to reimagine, to Dr. Christopher's point, as a new starting point that is fair and equitable and considers the wrongs, the needs, the beauty, the uniqueness of the people that are here today. So we're getting to a new evolution of humanity, because what they are doing is, the trickery is, if they say the devil's biggest secret is making us think you didn't exist, the colonizer's biggest secret is making us fight over their scraps. I don't know if that helped.
I recognize that USDA was really only formed to manage. Even when it comes to desalination, there are very simple systems that can be built that can desalinate at least 100 gallons a day. And I mean, very, very small, simple systems out of wood and some glass and a bucket that, or something that catches that desalinated water that gets evaporated. And so there's just so many considerations, and we don't have to always say, oh, they have all the good stuff. We don't have enough. We have just enough.
Thank you so much. I want to usher us. I see the hands, and everyone's going to get a chance just not in this moment of time. I have a couple of announcements, and y'all are gonna be happy when I tell you why we're wrapping up, but I wanted to give our panelists a moment to just share 1 minute, any last things that you feel you haven't got a chance to share. And it's fine if you say you feel fine. Okay, great, fantastic. So I am so, you all, this is like everything right now. And just the expertise of the folks who did participate in the dialogue, including those that I saw churning away. I felt so much brain like energy happening. I was like, I'm getting a headache, because I felt everyone so engaged in the dialogue, and it's very rare to bring together such a large group of folks that are so focused for an extended amount of time. So panelists and yourselves, round of applause, please. So as I said, you will have time. The time that we built in for you all to have the private conversations, we used to have the group conversation, which is a good thing, because the next thing that we're going to do is break bread together. And I can't think of a better way to really digest and process everything in this space than at those tables that we'll be enjoying food together. So the next thing is lunch, and I have just 2 quick announcements before y'all start running over to lunch. So the first thing is that you can check into your room here at Airlie at 3. So this will actually be done when we finish our final conversation for today. So I don't want folks to feel like they need to go walk up the hill and go try to get their bags. It ain't gonna be ready for you. So just be patient with that, and be aware that we're all staying here tonight. Your room is there for you, but we won't be able to start that check-in process until 3 o'clock. And then the other issue is that we want to know who all is in this space, and that's why we have name tags. And so if you have not yet received your name tag, please see Mariah. She will have a name tag for you. And outside of that, I want to thank you all so much for a job well done. Enjoy your lunch, and we'll be back here at 2:30, 2:40. See you at 2:40.